Hey VC, it's me again. Yeah, I'm back after only one day. Um, I find it's very helpful when I'm kind of feeling down to film more videos and to associate, get the word out there, and message you folks back and forth, talking to you. Um, Really helps for me anyway when I'm in a down mood. Anyway, this is a big one, and I'm going to try to keep this short, though I don't know. Well, short for me. I don't know how to do it based on the subject matter. Been thinking about this for days, and I'm just going to go to it. My last video, man, the sound was awful on that. I was playing music very low in the background, and yet what came out on microphone, it sounded like I had the thing turned up to 11. So that didn't work so well. You couldn't hear anything but some bass rumble anyway at that wonderful Copeland CD. Excuse me. Today, this is a big one. I don't know if I can keep this short. Gonna do how did I get into this weird music I'm into? And this is largely ECM artists, if not all of the albums are not ECM, but they're certainly ECM recording artists related. Back in the late 70s, when I was expanding my horizons musically, started listening to prog rock, which was kind of on its last legs, but had been very active, in the early 70s going in. And in some aspects, a lot of the more popular prog rock bands, with the advent of disco and commercialization of radio, started becoming less experimental toward the end of the 70s, and started cutting their song lengths down, and the disco beat was becoming popular, and some rock bands were kind of getting the disco beat in there. The prog bands couldn't get away with that, but they saw the signpost, and that is they better start cutting some more commercial things that could get on the radio, especially the American bands. Well, even a lot of the more popular British ones, actually. And so it kind of made me drive, because I was getting into the 20-minute tracks with tons of instrumental, and I got to the point I didn't really need the vocals much anymore. And all of a sudden the bands kind of stopped doing that. So it drove me to go through more obscure bands, even like French bands and bands that had some vocals to them, but they weren't even sung in English. I had no idea what they were singing about. I remember buying a Pulsar album, the group Pulsar, who I could still listen to some of their stuff now, actually. They've done some all-instrumental albums that were movie soundtracks, and they're a French band that at least three of the members stayed consistently through the group, primary one being, I believe, the keyboard player. And got a couple French bands that had vocals. It was a little frustrating not understanding the words. I mean, I was primarily interested in the instrumental end anyway, but there wasn't. Well, the import sections were very good in some record shops back then, because this is late 70s, so it was all record shops. But I kind of hit a dead end with that, and I was not finding things that pleased me so much. And at the same time, I think I was looking for something that was a bit more impressionistic, if not abstract. And my idea of what music could be, I guess, started expanding as well. And I had gotten, right around that time, into Klaus Schulze, and also a little bit of Tangerine Dream. To me, Tangerine Dream was a little bit of a step back, because Edgar Fress's guitar work was very rockish. And I had been listening to Klaus Schulze, which didn't have guitars, before that. And oddly enough, strictly by happenstance, the first several Klaus Schulze albums I happened to pick up had no drums on them. So eventually when I got through, and at that time he had 8 or 9 solo albums out. That was it, his first 8 or 9. And maybe about half of them didn't have any drums. And for some reason, oddly enough, just cherry picking them, I ended up getting the ones without drums, which I like the best because they have dated well. The way the drums were recorded on his albums in the 70s tends to date them a little bit. Sometimes they're very muddy. Other times, I don't know. It changes the whole focus of the music, certainly, because now you're listening for the beat. Whereas even with the sequencers before, they weren't as rhythmically strong as a drum beat, so you could kind of trail off. And I'm thinking about things like his very first solo album, Irrlicht, which is the second thing I bought by him, I think, and my favorite album of his. And Time Wind was the first thing I bought, and possibly Mirage was next. And so most of the ones that I bought were drummerless, and I like that. So when I picked up Tangerine Dream, the rockish guitar was kind of like, well, I'm kind of trying to get away from this direction a little bit. I've come to appreciate them and have tons, dozens, probably 75 or 100 albums by them, I don't know. But at the time, I was looking for something else. There was a music magazine that came out weekly here in New Jersey, and it was based around the club, mainly about the club scene and arts, but mostly music. But it was very big for the club owners to advertise the bands that were playing there, and that's pretty much how the newspaper probably got a lot of its revenue. And so it's very music oriented, and every issue had record reviews, which is the first thing I always go to. I read this review of this album that really sounded like the thing I was looking for, and by somebody I'd never heard of, and that was Bar Phillips' 3 Day Moon, back in the '78. Oh my! I've torn it. So this was recorded in '78. I want to say this probably early '78. This probably came out late '78, possibly early '79. And I went looking for this lovely, wonderful album. And believe it or not, the first 2 times I went to the record store, I couldn't find it. Why couldn't I find it? I looked in rock. I even looked at imports, though I didn't think it would be there. I may have looked in, there was no world music sections, and I was lost. I think I might have even looked in classical. Why it never dawned on me to look in jazz, I didn't know. Finally, or ask somebody who worked in the shop, but of course I'm a guy, I don't ask. About the 3rd trip in, I figured this is a new album. You know, why wouldn't a record store have it? And at that time, record stores had everything that was at least released domestically. You know, they were big, well-stocked stores in the late '70s. I finally asked, and this guy said, "Oh, it's over here in the jazz section." I'm like, what? Jazz? This isn't jazz. You know, my understanding of jazz was extremely limited, but what I knew about it was, you know, bebop, you know, Charlie Parker, whatever. The description of this album, even though it was by an upright bassist, and the first time I bought an album by an upright bassist, just about the first time I ever really focused on listening to upright bass. All the stuff I'd listened to had electric basses in it, and the only upright bass I would have heard would have been in soundtracks, you know. So not soundtracks that I bought, but I mean soundtracks of TV shows, movies, that kind of thing. So right off the bat, it had an interesting sound. Not necessarily foreign, but it had more of a woody, natural sound to the bass that you could hear, and I thought that was an interesting contrast to the very loud, very heavy, dark electric bass sound, you know, that rock bands had at the time. So, but I was floored when I first put this on, but I don't know if I was 100% ready for it. But I listened to it a whole bunch, and I got it very, very quickly, even if I didn't get it right off the bat. So this was recorded in March '78 with Bar Phillips and upright bass, and he composed all the pieces. Terje Repdahl, first time I ever heard him, naturally. On guitar synthesizer, and organ he plays on here. A guy named Dieter Feichner on synthesizer. More about Dieter later. And Trilak Ertu on tabla and percussion. First time I'd heard of any of these guys. Loved the playing right off the bat. Loved the tabla. I'd heard tabla before. Didn't really know what it was, but I love the way that the tabla drives the music without being an overly heavy drum sound, like the kind of sound you have on a drum kit, you know, when somebody hits that bass drum or the floor tom or something like that, and it just shakes the earth, you know. I really liked the fact that you could play a lot of rhythmic elements on the tabla drums, and it was putting the music forward, propulsive. and yet it wasn't loud. You can clearly hear the fingers on the tablet, and I love that sound. Now, I had heard it growing up in the 60s, of course, in soundtrack music and Indian music. That was popular, again, not movie soundtracks that I purchased, but soundtracks on TV, things that had the hippie Indian vibe going to them. So I wasn't completely unfamiliar with the sound of the drums, but I loved them right away, and it helps the fact that it was incredibly recorded like all the VCM stuff. Dieter Feichtner's synthesizers are really something on this album. The two albums that he recorded with Bar Phillips in particular, the synths have this really eerie, unique sound. You can't pinpoint it down to, oh, that's an ARP, or you can't pick out like that this was something that you would have heard in progressive bands or synthesizer-based bands before. He got some really oddball, imaginative, scary sounds out of his synthesizers. Terje Reptol is the perfect starting place for somebody coming from rock, because anybody that knows ECM knows Terje Reptol. You could say he has a rockish sound. It's a little distorted, but more than that, what I appreciated on it, especially at this time, to this day, is he had a more processed, sustained sound. So it wasn't so much about being dirty and fuzzy, and distorted, as it was having a sustained sound like Steve Hackett and Genesis did at the same time. And I love the sound. He used a very early guitar synthesizer on this, because the first ones I'm aware of came out in '78, which is when this was recorded. This is a good place to go if you're up for the impressionistic and abstract angles of it, which I was eventually. Didn't take long. But it also has something to hold on to, because even though the bass is an upright bass, yes, I'm used to hearing bass in rock music. You've got Terje Reptol's guitars, not far from rock, so I can relate to it. You got the synthesizers, even though they're eerie, I was very familiar with them from popular music. Trilak Ertu, no, I don't know a lot of tabla, but the whole percussive thing, I get the percussive thing, the beat, the rhythm. So it was only the music itself. There was no unusual instrumentation. I can hang my hat on the percussion. I can hang my hat on the bass. I can hang my hat on the guitar, certainly. Great place to start. And I just, that was it, folks. At that point, ECM had got my money for life, essentially. I went on, where this all led is going to get Mountainscapes, which was the next Bar Phillips, the prior Bar Phillips album, actually, the next one I picked up. Now that I knew where to find the stuff, you couldn't get me away from it. And the ECM records, almost everyone I ever bought came with these catalogs. Now, on this catalog, there's not that many releases listed on each of the pages. Subsequent catalogs probably had close to 100 albums listed on them, and the pictures got smaller, or they didn't exist at all, of the album covers. And each one told you the lineup. This is very important for me, because not only do I want to know who plays what on and what the lineup is, and are there any solo albums where an artist does all the instrumentation himself, but it's like, if you want to hear, say, two guitarists, there you go, I'll buy Sargasso C. It's just two guitars. Great. I want to hear a bigger band. I'll go into Jack DeJohnette, whatever. Dave Holland, I want to hear a solo piano, whatever. This was a smart marketing tool. And, they constantly updated them with the new releases. And these catalogs got to the point where, what you're seeing there are big pictures. They got small to non-existent pictures. But they were very careful in listing all the musicians that played on the albums and what the instrumentation was. So you could just cherry pick through this and say, you know what, I don't have any solo piano albums. I want to hear an album just horns with no rhythm section, or something bizarre like that. And I would listen to the albums. I'd be spinning the albums, and after I read whatever information was on here about the musicians and where it was recorded and who wrote the material, I would go to the catalogs and say, oh, I see what my next purchase is. Or I should say my next 500 or 600 purchases, because that's what it led to. So Mountainscapes, another great album. And again, another quartet lineup. Bart Phillips wrote all the music. Plays upright bass, obviously, again. He's got Dieter Feichtner again on synthesizer. His weird synthesizer sounds beautiful, just incredibly. They could be spooky at times. They could be haunting. You didn't know what they were going to play. And a few changes here on the percussionists. Is no longer Trilok Ertu, or actually it was Stu Martin on this. Is again the first time I heard Stu Martin, who had played for many years with Bar Phillips, and John Sermon in the lead voice on saxophones. He plays synthesizer also. And so you've actually got, this is very strange, you've got three people playing synthesizer. You've got Sermon playing synthesizer on here, Dieter Feichner, the main synthesizer player, and Stu Martin, the drummer, actually plays some synthesizer too. So, again, I was introduced to two musicians. Forget that. Two additional musicians that were new to me. Stu Martin and John Sermon, very important. Now, there's a guest on here. On one track only, the last track, because he was in the studio at the time that this album was being recording an album on his own, and Manfred Eicher, ECM producer, suggested to Bar Phillips, why don't you have him guest and come down, play an improv, a solo or something like that. So here comes John Abercrombie. First time I ever heard John Abercrombie. This is a weird place to hear John Abercrombie for the first time. With all his solo albums and the bands that the more commercial, like Brecker Brothers bands that he played with, that's where a lot of people heard him. Not me. I heard him on a Bar Phillips album the first time, and he only played on one track. He does an improvised solo, very different from the Terje Reptil sound, and I love that right away. Right away, dug it. Even though you could tell it was pretty much his improvised solo, he was, and a very very clean sound. But I'm like, oh man, I like that guy's sound. So where did this all lead? Well, from listening to Terje Reptil, hearing him on Bar Phillips, I got to get an album by this guy. I bought this because primarily two reasons. It was one of the newest releases of his at the time. Reptil, Vidas, and DeJohnette. And it's a trio thing, and again, coming from the rock thing, I could relate to what's essentially guitar, bass, and drums trio. But again, it's upright bass, this time played by Miroslav Vidas. First time I ever heard Miroslav. And Jack DeJohnette. First time I ever heard Jack DeJohnette on drums. Both Miroslav Vidas and Terje Reptil also play keyboards on this. So it's a very lush, full sound. There's a lot of keyboards on here, split between Terje Reptil and Miroslav Vidas. There's a lot of overdubbing. And it sounds great. And I tell you, it's the first time I ever heard that style of drumming. It's essentially what I was to learn much later, the John Christensen style of drumming. Because as much as I loved it at first, and there's two fully improvised tracks on here, as much as I loved it at first, I didn't get, I'm like, why isn't he playing a beat? Like a straightforward groove beat. Truth is, had he done that, I wouldn't be listening to this album 40 years later. I probably would have tired of it. His playing was more, it was rhythmic, but it was more abstract. And it's what I kind of call like orchestral percussion, in that it seems to be more important to build the tension of the music and the dynamics up and down than it is to establish a beat and just stick with it like a drum machine would. Took me a while to understand it. Took me a while to really realize where this came from. Really, it's really a John Christensen thing, as Jack himself has even acknowledged over the years. And Jack DeJohnette is probably one of the best people besides John Christensen to ever play in that style. Took me a while to understand the drumming, but I love the music right off the bat. And again, I discovered a new artist through Bar Phillips, Terje Reptil, and also Miroslav Vidas, and also Jack DeJohnette. So what do I get next? My favorite, by the way, that's probably my second favorite Terje Reptil album, the very first Miroslav Vidas, Jack DeJohnette album. This is my all-time favorite, which was the next Terje Reptil one I bought, After the Rain. And I am, as I've probably said a million times before, and will continue to say, I'm a sucker for solo albums. Give me an album where one musician goes in and plays all the parts himself, and I love it. And that's what this is. I love the studio shot in here. The ECM didn't do enough of those shots of the musicians in the studio. Now, Terje's wife at the time did some wordless vocals on two tracks. but it's so far down in the mix, and it comes during sections where there's a lot of synthesizer keyboard chords being played, and you could barely tell that they're there. So essentially, it's a solo album, and she only appears on 2 tracks. This is a fantastic album. It's got, what, 10 tracks on here? Covers the stuff you would expect Terje to do, but there's no rhythm section, and you don't get to hear his music without a rhythm section very often. So it's certainly the most airy I've ever heard him play. He plays flute on here as well. I think there's 1 or 2 tracks that are just solo flute. The only place he's ever played acoustic guitar is on this album. He does, that I'm aware of. And I've pretty much heard all of his stuff. He has two short tracks on here are just him on acoustic guitar. One is live, essentially, just one, and one is overdub for two acoustic guitars. Apart from that, he does electric piano, keyboards. He plays a little bit of saxophone in one of the parts, and of course, he plays electric guitar. This is his masterpiece to this day. And again, I got into that because of Bar Phillips. So going back to the Bar Phillips thing. And I've got these out of order. But it doesn't really matter, does it? Well, okay. I got a Bar Phillips thing. Bar Phillips led me into the Terje Reptil album. Terje Reptil album led me to be introduced to Miroslav Vitous and Jack DeJohnette. This is not an ECM album. But here's a Miroslav Vitous album. On the Freedom Jazz label. It doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. I also picked this up on CD. It's a good thing I did because it doesn't look like it's in print anymore. What I like about this album, and boy, the reviews are horrible if you ever take a look on Amazon. It's almost a solo album. Again, only 2 musicians on this one. Miroslav plays everything. He plays the upright bass. He plays all keyboard parts. And the only other people on the album are percussionists. Don Elias plays percussion on all of the tracks except one. One track was recorded earlier than the other tracks on the album, and that was with a different hand percussionist. But again, just percussion. And so there's a lot of overdubbing with Miroslav Vitous playing bass, the upright bass, only. He doesn't play electric on this at all. And keyboards galore, some early monophonic mini Moog kind of sounding keyboards and stuff. People have slammed this album, and it's for a couple of reasons, and a couple of reasons, actually, some of the reasons I like it. It tends to meander, which is okay. Sometimes the music doesn't always have to progress. Sometimes you just want to sit in a spot and stay there. It does meander at times, maybe without direction a little bit. There's a little thing where there's some percussion beat going on, and Miroslav is kind of maybe aimlessly for a couple minutes soloing on a mini Moog. There's a little bit of sound. You can tell this wasn't recorded on ECM. I was very disappointed when I first heard it because some of the percussion, the drums sound okay, but not as good as an ECM production. Some of the hand percussion by Don Elias, and it's not his fault, sounds like he's banging on cardboard boxes because the engineer didn't know how to record whatever instrument he was playing. It sounded like he's banging on some kind of wooden, I don't know, almost like wooden congas, but so, and did not know how to record them, so it comes out sounding very flat and almost ruins the experience during this particular track that it's on. There's another problem that it could be the way I hear things, but it also sounds like the mini Moog that he's using, or the primary electric keyboard solo instrument, sounds like it's not completely in tune with the acoustic piano. That's a little bit of a problem. The electric piano sounds okay, but the acoustic piano with the synth sounds a little bit off. But when this works, I just really like it. I like the album cover. I like that vibe. It took me a while after hearing him play on ECM and the way ECM was recording all their instruments, but especially the clarity and depth of the drums and percussion. especially with Tree Like Urtu stuff. It hurts to hear the percussion recorded on this is not very good at all. But I love the album, and I love it maybe for a lot of the reasons that people don't like it. I like some of the meandering stuff. I just like Miroslav. It's one of my favorites. What can I say? It's almost. I just wish, had it been recorded by ECM, I think you would have really heard the potential of what was behind the music. Now, going back to Bar Phillips again, John Abercrombie did guest appearance on Mountainscapes, improvising a solo on the last track, which I loved. It's like I gotta find this guy, John Abercrombie. I think this was the first thing of his I bought. Again, I'm not 100% sure of the order, but I know the first two John Abercrombie albums I bought. And Gateway 2 was one of them, and I picked this up. This was also a very recent release at the time because this was recorded in '77. And forgive me because I'm leaving out the recording dates of some of these. I think the Miroslav Vidas thing was recorded in the older track was recorded in December '76, and July '77 the bulk of the album was recorded. And oddly enough, this was also recorded in July of '77, the Gateway 2 album. Most people know Gateway. This is my favorite album by them. John Abercrombie, I heard an interview with him. He dismissed it a little bit. I think I know why. I think because they didn't write a lot of stuff before going into the studio with this. Anyway, I had heard Abercrombie on that one solo, do that one solo on Bar Phillips' album, decided I got to hear him on his own or, more of him. So I picked this up because, once again, essentially you have a trio, a guitar, bass, and drums trio. Of course, in the jazz sense, it's different. With John Abercrombie on guitars, and also playing, in addition to electric, acoustic guitars and his wonderful electric mandolin, which I can't get enough of. And you got Jack DeJohnette again. I know that guy from somewhere. Oh, from that Terry Schirintel album I just showed. So Jack DeJohnette on drums again. So, a couple of guys that I'm a little familiar with there. Jack plays piano on one track called Blue, a track that he wrote, and he had recorded this tune, Blue, on a couple occasions. This is by far the best. It's also the sparsest. Long gaps of silence between the notes at times when just the piano holds out. There's no drums on that one track alone. Simply beautiful. And basically what this was is Dave Holland wrote two pieces for this album. John Abercrombie wrote one, and Jack wrote that piece, Blue. The reason I think John kind of dismissed this album, and I wish he would go back and listen to it, is possibly because the first 16 minutes and 17 seconds is something called Opening, the first track on the album. It's completely improvised, and I dig it. This track blows me away. It's not live, but it's very close to being live, and it's very, very unusual to start off an album with a 16-minute improvisation in the studio that they totally made up. And I don't think John's given himself enough credit here. So it's got Jack on drums, Dave Holland on bass. By the way, this was my introduction to Dave Holland, so you can see one thing leads to another. And on that track, Opening, it's very interesting because I've read people's reviews of this album over the years. When I first heard it, I didn't understand why there was no guitar chords. John was not playing any guitar chords at all on that track for 16 minutes. And all you hear is what sounds like the high end of the guitar, soloing, high up on the neck, the higher pitched notes, and playing them pretty much single notes at a time. Years and years later, and after listening to a lot of John, I realized there's no guitar on the track at all, that John is playing the electric mandolin on this track, which is why there's no full chords, there's no deeper bass notes like you would typically hear on a guitar. It took me probably a couple of years to even catch that. And there's a couple moments where he's got a repeating line that Abercrombie plays on the electric mandolin that he kind of doubles, or he does a little harmony with, that he overdubs just at a couple brief points, maybe for less than a minute of the entire track. Little theme he plays, which I can hear in my head right now. So how bad could it be if I could still sing that theme all these years later? And so if you hear it, you would probably wonder the same thing. That considering there's only bass and drums under him, why is he not playing any chords to fill out the sound? It's because that entire 16-minute track is him playing the electric mandolin on top of it. And once you realize that, and Jack's playing fierce as hell on this, it's incredible. And I liked it. Naturally, I liked it right off the bat. So what do? I got to go out and I got to buy another John Abercrombie album. I showed this for probably different reasons before. Now, characters. Why did I buy this? November 77, so at that time, because it was talking about 78, 79, it was a new release. But, and this is the only time he's done this, all solo. Only time John's done a solo album, completely solo. And it's hard to do. There's not unlike Terje Reptel, where Terje's playing keyboards and flute and guitars and even saxophone and stuff like that. John sticks to guitars here. So there's only really 3 instruments on here. There's a 6-string acoustic guitar, a 6-string electric guitar, and his lovely electric mandolin. Now he also uses some processing on the electric guitar. So he's got some, and uses a volume pedal, so it tends to sound more keyboard-like, at least in one track. But it's not as sparse sounding as you may think, because there's quite a lot of overdubbing. The album starts off with the longest track at 10.5 minutes, called Parable, and it starts with 4 or 5 minutes of solo electric mandolin. And you probably think, where is this going? And all of a sudden, all these acoustic guitars come in and start playing this repeating pattern, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's not avant-garde at all. It's not difficult. It has more acoustic guitars than I've ever heard John play anywhere. It's got the lovely electric mandolin thing of his, and it's probably got just about his best writing too. He's got a few longer pieces on here, are more epic in scope, like the first one. And the last one, which is him playing sustained guitar chords, and he fades them in very, very softly using a volume pedal on the guitar. Absolutely beautiful. In between are shorter tracks that are essentially, I guess you would say, ballads. Really beautiful stuff. Pretty much acoustic guitar based. Maybe there's electric guitar playing over it. Man, I tell you, if you don't like this album, I don't know. I don't know. You might not like instrumental music, or there's, and this, this wasn't hard for me to get into, but again, it was. He's not a Terje Reptel where he's using a sustained, very processed sound. So I was slowly getting out of or very probably quickly getting out of the aggressive thing and getting into more impressionistic music, and even gaining appreciation for abstract music. This isn't really abstract music. This is easy stuff to get into, I think. If you can appreciate quiet music at all. He did a couple of these tracks. I know one of them or two of them he's re-recorded in more of a band context. The ballads, which are absolutely beautiful. So, I bought the Gateway album. I bought the Reptel Vetus DeJohnette album. So, naturally, I've got to get a Jack DeJohnette album. How did I pick pictures? By the way, turns out even after, 40, I don't know how many Jack DeJohnette albums I have, this is still my favorite. Though this one is probably a little tough to get into. I bought this, it was, this is recorded in 76, so it was fairly recent, again, at that time period. But again, it's almost a solo album, half solo, half duo album. Love that. It's got 6 tracks. Jack playing all the instruments on 3 of them by himself, and the other 3 are duets with John Abercrombie. You already knew Abercrombie from Gateway and from the Bar Phillips albums and stuff. This I have very. I made a cassette tape that I kept in my car, and I have this image of me playing it. I was waiting for somebody in a parking lot somewhere at night, a very cold winter night, and I had my engine turned off, and it was getting colder and colder, waiting for them to show up. And I had my tape player in my car going with this album playing, and I don't know why I remember that. otherwise unmemorable evening. But this is Jack playing, drum kit naturally. He also plays piano and organ. And the opening thing is very abstract. He's playing more of a beat on that one, but it's pretty wild and it's going all over the place. But there's this chord cluster that is very dissonant, that he's just holding down, sustaining on the organ over this wild drum thing. The second piece, which is that piece is entirely solo, and the last piece is entirely solo with Jack playing a beautifully sparse thing. One of my favorite pieces of his, actually, Picture 6, which is the last track that I'm referring to as his piano playing on it, and that track Blue that he wrote on the Gateway 2 album are my two favorite compositions of Jack's. And in between, he's got this wonderful duet he does. It's a live thing without overdubbing with John Abercrombie on acoustic guitar, and Abercrombie is following Jack playing drum rolls on the various drums that are pitched, and Abercrombie is playing the same note on the guitar back and forth very, very rapidly, while Jack goes around the kit playing these 3 or 4 notes, so they match each other. And you can tell they must have been watching each other to look for the clue of when Jack is going to go to the next drum, and John Abercrombie's got to change the note. And it goes into this march thing. It sounds like a Spanish march almost, with just a single acoustic guitar and the drum kit. And it's really wonderful, and yet I've read people slam that piece. And yet Jack selected that particular piece for his Rerum compilation. So how bad could it be if Jack selected it as one of his favorite pieces from his ECM years? I love that piece. At first I thought maybe they should have overdubbed another acoustic guitar to fill out the sound, but listening to it now, I don't hear that. There's another track that is electric guitar and drums, a little more up tempo. There's a beat to that. That's live also. It's just a single electric guitar with drums. And then there's a much more abstract piece that has 2 electric guitars playing very eerily over Jack's drums. And a wonderful drum solo. How often can you sing a drum solo? And I could sing Jack's drum solo on this piece because he's very much playing around with the pitch of the drums. Second piece on here is actually Jack playing just drum solo, live drum solo, but he's playing this melody on the drums. And after you hear it a couple times, you can pick it out. I'm almost tempted to sing it. So it's really fantastic. Of course, you have to have the stamina to listen to drum solos, or else you're not going to like it probably very much. And Jack's made more commercial albums certainly than this. Love this. Couldn't wait for this to come out in CD in America, and I actually had to send to ECM mail order in the late 80s, pretty much before the internet, because they had released this on CD in Germany, but I couldn't get it here, and I just couldn't wait any longer. Another fantastic album. So you can see how I'm discovering all these artists thanks to Bar Phillips. Then Bar Phillips bought this as a new release. You didn't need to convert me to Bar Phillips by this point. So in Journal Violin 2, which I could speak volumes about, and Carm did an incredibly beautifully job on this album, when this came out, I couldn't grab it fast enough. But this is very different, not only from Bar Phillips' prior albums, but all of a sudden I have no guitarist to listen to. But by this time I was ready. This is Bar Phillips again on bass. And this is quite a different thing because there's no harmonic, no chordal instruments on here. There's no pianos, no guitars. It's Ina Kamanis on voice. First time I heard her, and I was floored by her absolute talent. And I've talked about her before, as has Carm. And incredible pitch and incredible vocals. And John Sermon, who of course I was familiar with John from Bar Phillips' previous album. Now John's playing horns on here as always. He plays soprano, baritone, saxophone, bass, clarinet, and he plays synthesizer here. Synthesizer is kind of important because I said there's no chordal instrument. This is an old monophonic synthesizer. So the interesting thing is you've got these instruments that, Bar Phillips plays sometimes he plays 2 notes on the bass at the same time. not most of the time. There's no chords going on. You've obviously got a vocalist who can only sing one note at a time. You got a horn player who's only playing one note at a time. Now there are some overdubs on here, and that's where the punch really comes in for me, because the keyboards, you would never think with such a thin lineup. There's no drums, there's no percussion, there's no chordal instrument filling out the sound stage. You'd think it would sound very sparse, and yet it doesn't. And a little bit of that is because there's some overdubbing on here, but a large part of it's because it's recorded so damn well, so you hear all these subtleties in the individual instruments. And also there's this thing going on in the background that I almost exclusively listen to. It's weird because instead of listening to like the horn solo or something like that, you wouldn't think that an album like this has a foreground and a background, but it does. There's John Surman playing at various times through this, is just holding out a single note for X amount of seconds before switching to the next note on a synthesizer. And Ina Kemenas is harmonizing with the keyboard, with the synthesizer. And even after all these years, and having this on CD and LP and listening to both of them, it's really hard to tell which one's the synthesizer and which one's the voice, almost. It's that perfect. She just holds out, not only does she hold out the notes, but her pitch doesn't waver. It's in beautiful harmony, and it's in the background. And I'm not even listening to what the main thing that's going on is, which is like a horn solo, and Bar Phillips is jumping all over the bass fretboard. And yet, I'm listening to this background, and I always go there. The background itself could be a separate track. And you would not think that with, 3 musicians, none of them playing harmonic instruments. And this, as much as I love the other albums and I got an appreciation for new music, and this is quite a bit more abstract than the others, this really put me into the next stratosphere of music appreciation. And like Carm said, it's a fantastic cover. I would have bought it anyway. But I can't believe anybody started with this like Carm did. This is not an easy, accessible point, even for Bar Phillips music. But how Carm got into it and he got it, I'm flabbergasted. I don't know. But this is probably my favorite Bar Phillips album, and I love the other ones. And a lot of times, your favorite album ends up being the first one or first or second one that you buy by an artist. This is just fantastic. It really opened my ears. There's no real rhythm section going on. There's no guitar for me to hang my hat on. There's no percussion for me to hang my hat on. The synthesizer is not the kind of synthesizer I'm used to hearing, the thick chordal synthesizers, with electronic textures. It's modified. The synthesizer is almost like another horn on here, or like say a flute would be, in terms of the timbre that's used on there. And it really opened me to listen to eventually get into things and appreciate things like the Azimuth Trio, which is another odd trio without any percussive instruments, on ECM, which I'll do a video on them. But that's just piano and voice and horn, also in that case trumpet. But this album, once I understood it and got into it, it really made it possible for me to appreciate things where I can't play any of the instruments here, and yet I could just appreciate the music. And it certainly led me into more abstract lands, and even more ECM artists. Maybe even seek out Bar Phillips, the original Journal Violin 1. I just saw on the internet somewhere that he's got a Journal Violin 9, which means somehow I missed 3 through 8 completely. Most of those are actually acoustic bass solo albums. This was recorded live in 1968. I know it's written on here somewhere and I can't find it now. Yeah, November of 68 in London, in the parish church of St. James. I had to get this mail order. I don't even know where I got it. It was new, new sealed album. This has never come out on CD. Again, it's just solo bass, pretty avant-garde stuff. You have to be up for listening to solo bass. But it's a nice out, and I just played it again after not having heard it for like 30 years, as well as some of the ECMs that I did on my earlier video, like the Derek Bailey, Dave Holland thing. The video of the ECM that's never come out on CD. I haven't played a lot of those in 20, 30 years, and I played the Derek Bailey and Dave Holland thing. Actually attempted to record it into my computer even so I could listen to it more, and that's just a bunch of noise. Essentially, it's like somebody plucking strings and stuff like that, but I really dug it. I probably listened to it like half a dozen times in the last week. But this is not an ECM album, by the way. But this is, I had to get this mail order, never saw this in the shops, and somebody showed this. I was trolling through some old videos. I think I saw somebody was a turntablist who did an ECM. I think it was him who showed this album. I could be wrong. And that video was already like 2 years old. Somebody showed this recently. Well, I've seen it recently. I don't think their video was recent. But I'm surprised that there's more than 5 people that have this. And again, I am going to I'm going to copy this one into the computer as a keeper as soon as I can. Now, as I was mentioning, how one thing leads to another with John Sermon's appearances on 2 of the 3 albums, Bar Phillips, that I bought, fairly in a short time span. So naturally, I had to get John Sermon, and this is where my memory is a little faulty. I'm not really 100% sure of what my first Sermon recording was. There's not much to see there. This was more than likely one of the early ones that I picked up, mostly because of the time frame, because it was recorded in '79, and I probably picked that up as a fairly new release at the time. And obviously, he's recorded a lot after that I've picked up, but I don't know how many ECMs he did prior to this. So this probably was the first John Sermon solo album I bought, and one of the reasons why I would select it, even if there were many more available, was, guess what? It's an all-solo album, so you got John doing the soprano and baritone saxophones, bass clarinet, and synthesizers, which is exactly what he played on the Journal Violin 2 album by Bar Phillips. Which I'm sorry, because I failed to mention the date. June 1979 was when Journal Violin 2 was recorded, and this was recorded May 79, so it makes sense. This was actually recorded just before the Bar Phillips album, so he was using the exact same instruments, the same synthesizer. Here he actually uses, as he does on all his solo albums, he does use the synthesizer sequencer to play repeating phrases. He didn't do that on the Journal Violin 2 album. That would have certainly made the sound more full. I wouldn't say it would have ruined the album in any way, but by not having the sequencer constantly playing something, it also makes it more sparse. And in the case of Journal Violin 2, certainly works to the advantage of that album. On his solo albums, he tends I love the sequences he sets up. And a very, very early synthesizer. These little repeating phrases that he solos over. And he does a lot of tracks without any synthesizer, and a lot of tracks without sequencers. I think there might only be 2 or 3 tracks on here that use the sequencer. Fantastic, fantastic. And I love, I might be missing like one of his latest solo albums on ECM, but I pretty much have almost all of his ECM solo things and some things outside of the ECM field that he's done as well, that are excellent. My favorites still are all his solo albums. He's got maybe about 6 or so of them now. He did one, Salt Ash Bells, I think it's called, and I should have pulled it out, but I didn't. That came out not that long ago, a year or 2 ago. Very good. I like his solo things. There's a little more space to them. It's pure John Sermon, and obviously by this point I no longer needed to have percussion going on or guitars or anything to appreciate the artistry involved. So I'm pretty sure this had to be one of the early Sermon pickups. The other ones I'm quite sure about the order I picked them up in, and just because I like this album, I'm going to show it, but also just to additionally show how one artist in the ECM world leads to another. Having really appreciated John Abercrombie's Characters album, recorded in '77, the only all solo album Abercrombie ever did. I'm still waiting for him to do another one. I like that, and the closest you can come to it is the duets that he's done with Ralph Towner, Sargasso Sea. This is from '76, so this is recorded actually before Characters. So it's just two guitars, and Ralph Towner does play piano on this. And unlike a lot of other people, they did an album 5 years after this called 5 Years Later. I prefer this one actually by far. 5 Years Later doesn't have any piano on it, and the little bits of, I think, 2 tracks that have piano on here break up the album nicely. I don't know, I kind of lost the thread a little bit here, because I'm not 100% sure that this was necessarily my introduction to Ralph Towner. I don't think it was. I probably picked up other things that he did in the ECM catalog long before I got into Oregon, simply because of the catalogs that they would include in many of their albums. You know, and you could look and see, and oh, this guy's interesting because he doesn't play electric guitars. But I just, I have to give this one a shout out because I love this one so much. This is probably my second favorite John Abercrombie album, because it's the closest one in spirit to Characters, and Characters is by far my favorite John Abercrombie disc. So to go back all the way to the beginning, one of the first things I heard of, going back to Bar Phillips, was Trilok Ertu, Terje Reptile, which I've showed his album. Trilok Ertu, I tried to follow his career and actually did fairly successfully for a long time. But at that time, he was very young. But when he did that Bar Phillips album in '78, he had probably just left India, I think, and was starting to make a name for himself out in Europe. I know he lived in Berlin, Germany for a long time. But he was just starting to play, and I didn't find a lot of things with him on it until a couple years later. I know he played on the Alfred Hearth album that came out, that was recorded, I think, in '82. But I started to see him as a sideman. This is many, many years before he started a solo career. And then eventually, I was into Oregon, naturally, the band Oregon. And he was the percussionist that took over for Colin Walcott when Colin Walcott died. By that time, I was full-fledged. I knew who all these guys were, and I was very familiar with Trilok. But that was quite a surprise. Didn't see that one coming. The only guy here that is kind of missing out, and now I don't know where I have to go off camera to show this, and I hope I won't lose too many of you here. Give me a minute. Sorry, I should have had this ready. The guy that I mentioned on the first Bar Phillips album, because I loved all those guys, the 3 guys that were introduced to me on Bar Phillips' 3-Day Moon. Trilok Ertu on percussion, Terje Reptile, which obviously I went out and bought his solo albums. The other guy that was an obscurity to me was the synthesizer player, Dieter Feichner, who I had to, just based on the performance on the two Bar Phillips albums, I searched in vain for solo stuff. And you have to think, this is before the internet. And it didn't get much easier after the internet either, because, man, you can't find much on this guy. On YouTube, there's a couple tracks. The people who posted them don't write the little notes in English. So there's a couple very brief Dieter Feichner tracks on YouTube. And they appeared to be things that were written for soundtracks, and possibly even television soundtracks. I searched in vain, even as imports. You can't find anything on this guy. Eventually, probably about 2010, 2011, I found that there was a label in Germany called Canto Crudo, I think is what they're called, that released that disc that I just showed. Yes, Canto, CANTO-CRUDO.com. 2005, I think that disc came out. Anyway, I found out that there was this Dieter Feichner 3-disc set that came out. Can't get it here. Can't get it as an import. Couldn't get it anywhere. There was one guy that was importing copies that was like a part-time record importer guy. He's like, I don't know if I can get you a copy or not, just by email. I don't even know how. Eventually, I had to. I don't think I knew what the label was. It took me about 3 years to get it. So here I am, all these years later. It took me 36 years after first hearing him on Bar Phillips' 3-Day Moon to get the Dieter Feichner Anthology Volume 1. This is only going to be a Volume 1, I think. 3-disc set, about 3 hours and 10 minutes. Unfortunately, the last disc is defective on this, and I'll be damned if I'm going to send it back to Germany to try to get a replacement. So thankfully, it's only the last track on disc 3 that was defective. I tried for days and days and days just to copy it into my computer because that's how I listen to most of my music, and I got most of the track. It skips a little bit. But very, very out there avant-garde stuff. This was recorded by a friend who was an engineer, recording engineer of Dieter Feichner. Over the years, in between like 82 and 99, I think these were recorded, or 90s, somewhere. Apparently Dieter Feichner died in 99, which I was unaware of. And this did not come out until after his death. But this is just totally solo, totally live electronics. Very, very actually much more avant-garde than even his playing on the Bar Phillips albums. It's pretty noisy at times, very much in the electronic, like Morton Feldman vein, the early electronic artists. But I can appreciate it for what it is, and it's kind of the fruits of a 36-year-long search to get something of this. And now that I know I don't even know that the record label does a whole lot of mail order necessarily to the United States. It took me a long time to get this, and a lot of effort, and it wasn't outrageously expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. It was about what you pay for 3 CDs. I mean, there's no break on there. But to me, it's kind of like coming full circle that I finally got some Dieter Feichner music. Because I was certainly able to follow the careers and have many albums by all of the artists that appeared on those early Bar Phillips albums that I bought. Even Trilok Ertu, not only do I have a zillion appearances of him as a sideman, but I've got all of his early solo albums, like maybe his first 10 or so, many of which are out of print now. And his appearances with Oregon and everything else. I've got tons of Tarja Riptal, John Abercrombie, all the things that outgrew from Bar Phillips, and Tarja Riptal then got me into Miroslav Vidas, and I've got a ton of his stuff, and Jack DeJohnette, and I got a ton of his stuff. And it's just I was so glad to eventually get that Dieter Feichner thing, just so I could have see each artist in their own element on their own. Dieter Feichner thing, very interesting because it was recorded over a number of years by an engineer friend of his. And if it wasn't for that friendship, the music would have never seen the light of day, unfortunately. So guys, I knew I was going to go long with this, but I didn't make it a 90-minute movie like I thought it might be anyway. I wasn't just trying to be long. I'm just trying. This is how I almost dreaded doing this video, because I knew I had a lot of explaining to do, and I wanted to show the interconnectedness of how I jumped from one artist to the other. Hopefully, I showed that. Hopefully, I didn't rush through things so that you didn't get a feeling for the music on the actual albums themselves. I think that's the important thing to convey in these videos is what's on this album. What does it sound like? And I tried to show a whole bunch of things, and hopefully I went into enough detail into what they sound like. So that's it, guys. My love of ECM continues, and the artists associated with them, even if they don't necessarily always record albums for ECM. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, because this is the one that was hanging over my head to do. But I knew it was going to be a long one. It's my marathon so far. Rob, you're probably going to be watching this in about 20 different sections, buddy. But good day to everybody. Thank you for all your kind comments and listening to me ramble and listen to my music and everything. Just everything. Great friendships that I've made here. Just absolutely incredible. I feel like I walked into, in a way, a new school and a new classroom, like I just moved into a new town and immediately made a whole bunch of really quality friends, which doesn't happen often. So thanks, guys. I'm going to try to keep this under 60 minutes, but it'll be seconds under. Okay, guys. Hope I haven't kept you up too late. I will be back soon. Take care.